A 12-year-old girl from the poorest corner of the city runs into a burning car to save a stranger's life. But what she didn't know was that the man she pulled from the flames was the very one who had once shattered her family's future. And when he leaned in and whispered something in her ear, she broke down in tears. If you believe in second chances, in the power of truth, and the quiet strength of a child's heart, this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe for more heart-touching stories like this, and tell me in the comments, what do you think he said to her? The city at midnight never truly sleeps, but the slums on the far east edge do, quietly, sadly, under the buzz of mosquitoes, the stench of uncollected trash, and a blanket of smoke-streaked darkness. Leona sat on the doorstep of their crumbling apartment, feet propped on an old paint can, staring up at the few stars not yet swallowed by factory smoke. A loud crash, then shattering glass, then tires screeching across asphalt. Leona shot to her feet. Just down the street, near the gas station corner, a black car had flipped on its side. The sharp smell of gasoline filled the air. A flicker of light sparked beneath the wreck. Fire. The car burst into flames. Neighbors rushed toward it, but froze at the edge of the scene. No one dared get closer. "Is someone in there?" Leona screamed. No one answered, but through the shattered window, she saw a trembling hand gripping the car's frame. Someone was in there. A man. Without thinking, Leona bolted through the crowd. "Somebody stop her! Is that kid crazy?" No one could stop her. She ducked under the barrier and ran straight into the smoke and flames. The heat felt like it was about to set her hair on fire. But she stayed low, crawling toward the wreck, yanking at the twisted door. A bloodied face came into view. He was unconscious. His expensive dress shirt was scorched and torn. Leona pulled. It wouldn't budge. She gritted her teeth, slipped, then screamed, pushing herself harder. One more time. Then he slid out of the car, just as a small explosion burst behind them. She dragged him away, hands scraped and burning. The whole street was glowing with firelight now. Moments later, the ambulance arrived. Police blocked the road. Bystanders pulled out their phones to film. A firefighter grabbed Leona, yelling something about burns. But she just stared at the man lying there, still unconscious. No one knew his name. No one asked hers. There was only fire, sirens, and the breathless stillness of a night when fate quietly changed direction. Leona slipped back into the shadows, away from the lights. She didn't need praise. She just needed her grandma not to wake up one morning and say, "We have to move again." And that man, by tomorrow, the whole city would know who he was. But tonight, he was just someone who owed a child his life, without realizing that debt would change everything he thought he knew. The man Leona had risked her life to pull from the flames that night wasn't a stranger. He was Harlan Voss, the millionaire behind a wave of foreclosures that had torn countless families apart. A name the elderly avoided, the poor despised, and the financial world revered like a god. Harlan woke up in a VIP hospital suite just hours after the crash. His left eye was bruised, his right arm in a cast, but his heart felt like stone. "Did someone save me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. A nurse replied quietly, "A girl, about 12. She pulled you out of the car." Harlan closed his eyes. He didn't say thank you, didn't ask for more details. He just repeated one sentence, like he was talking to himself. "I don't need charity." The next day, headlines exploded across the media. "Unknown girl saves notorious millionaire. Little angel in the fire." But the girl, Leona, had vanished. She didn't show up for press conferences. She didn't accept praise. She even avoided the swarm of reporters combing through the slums, and that unsettled Harlan. That night, he called in his most trusted assistant and told him to find the girl. Not out of gratitude, not out of guilt. He just couldn't shake the feeling that her face looked familiar. 2 days later, the assistant returned with a thin file. "Her name's Leona, lives with her grandmother, Essie. She used to work as a housekeeper for your family 40 years ago." Harlan went still. Essie, a name he thought had been buried in the past, along with a dismissal he'd once considered no big deal. A quiet, honest woman who always wore the same faded floral apron. She cared for him like a mother, until the day he sent her away without a word of explanation. Without saying the one thing he'd never had the courage to say in all those years. "I was wrong." That night, for the first time in 10 years, Harlan couldn't sleep. He stared at the hospital ceiling as if begging his memories to stay away. But they didn't. They came back with the fire-lit face of a child who had saved his life, completely unaware that he was the man who had once pushed her grandmother to the very edge of society. Maybe, just maybe, life still held a debt that no amount of money could ever repay. In the small apartment at the end of a crumbling row of houses, Essie was making tea with a chipped porcelain teapot. It was part of her wedding set. Not pretty, not expensive, but it had never once cracked. Leona sat beside her, still shaken from the night of fire. Her grandmother didn't ask many questions. She simply handed the girl a cup and said, "You did the right thing, but sometimes doing right still hurts." Leona didn't fully understand the words, but she could hear something different in her grandmother's voice, as if she were wrapping up a memory that was close to breaking open. That afternoon, a man in a black suit knocked on their door. He was Harlan's assistant. "Mr. Voss would like to express his gratitude," he said carefully. "He's offering a financial gesture for you and your granddaughter." Essie didn't give Leona time to react. She rose, walked to the door, and quietly shut it in the man's face. "My granddaughter saved a life," she said through the crack, her voice as calm as still water. "Not for a price." That night, when Leona quietly got up for a glass of water, she saw her grandmother sitting alone in front of an old wooden chest, the one she'd never let Leona touch. The lid was open. Inside was a small wooden box wrapped in a faded embroidered handkerchief. Leona stayed hidden behind the door, watching in silence. Her grandmother opened the box and pulled out a handwritten letter, yellowed with time. An old photograph of herself as a young woman, standing in a grand garden, and something silver gleaming softly under the desk lamp. A pocket watch engraved with 2 letters, HV. Leona nearly gasped. That was the name of the man she had just saved. The next day, when Leona asked, her grandmother simply said, "There was a time I believed people were fairer than they truly are." Then she placed the box in Leona's lap. "My little Leona has now stepped into the story I tried to bury all my life." Leona didn't understand everything, but she felt it in her bones. That watch was a key, and her grandmother had lived through a hurt no one had ever dared ask about. She looked at the silver watch resting in her palm and had the strange sense that what had just happened was only the beginning. A secret was waking up. An old debt had never been settled, and a 12-year-old girl now stood at the heart of a tragedy passed down through generations, still waiting to be named. 3 days after the fire, Leona stood once again at the gates of the city hospital, her grandmother's silver pocket watch carefully wrapped in a handkerchief and hidden in her coat pocket. Essie hadn't said much when Leona asked to go. She just nodded and said softly, "If you believe the truth deserves to be returned, then let it find its way back." The VIP hospital room was quiet. Harlan Voss lay with his head resting on a pillow, eyes gazing out the window where sunlight spilled through the glass. When Leona walked in, he didn't look surprised. He didn't smile. He simply said slowly, "My brave little girl has come back." Leona didn't say a word. She stepped forward and handed him the small box, her eyes steady and unblinking. Harlan opened it, and time seemed to freeze. The silver pocket watch lay there, intact, a slight scratch on the edge, undeniably his, the one he'd believed had been stolen. The night he fired Essie, without asking a single question. His hand trembled. "I thought she took it. I remember not even letting her explain," he murmured, eyes glassy, caught somewhere between guilt and regret. Leona sat down beside the bed. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "My grandmother wasn't a thief. She kept it for a different reason, but I guess you never wanted to know." Harlan gripped the watch tightly in his hand, his throat tightening. "I used to think I'd been betrayed, but the truth is, I betrayed the only person who ever treated me like family." His voice dropped. "The butler back then, he set your grandmother up. He couldn't stand seeing a black housemaid trusted more than he was." He turned to Leona, as if trying to see through her eyes into a memory buried too deep for too long. "You didn't just save my life. You pulled me out of the blindness I've lived in for most of it." Leona stood, looking at him for a long moment. "My grandmother doesn't want your money, but she deserves your apology." Then she walked out, leaving Harlan alone with the silver watch ticking steadily in his hand, like time knocking against the walls of his conscience. For the first time in years, Harlan Voss asked himself, could fame, wealth, and power ever buy back a peaceful night's sleep? After the silver pocket watch was returned to Harlan, it seemed like the story had come to a close. But it hadn't. With men like Mr. Voss, there's always a second layer, where redemption rarely comes without a price, and never with true sacrifice. Just a few days later, Leona and Grandma Essie received an invitation to move into a luxury apartment complex. No more leaking tin roof when it rained, no more shouting neighbors, blaring sirens, or splitting the last piece of bread at night. A black SUV came to pick them up. The doorman bowed as they arrived. The elevator had an attendant. The apartment was gleaming, fully furnished, with a bed big enough for 3 people and a balcony overlooking the city park. Leona stayed quiet, but Grandma Essie just shook her head gently. Sweetheart, beauty doesn't mean it's not a trap. And then the day of the appreciation ceremony for the little hero finally came. The media crowded around, snapping photos of Leona standing beside Mr. Voss. Flashbulbs popped nonstop. She wore a pristine white dress, holding a large bouquet, and said nothing. A PR staffer leaned in and whispered to him, "She's exactly the image we need. A young black savior, perfect for the social responsibility campaign." That night, tucked in the corner of a room, Leona overheard a phone call. A man's voice, cold, calculated. "We just need the girl to show up a few times. Once we have the photos, her part's done." Leona froze. She wasn't the hero of this story. She was a prop, a well-placed piece in Harlan's massive PR machine. A pawn polishing the reputation of a man who had destroyed families like hers, like the broken-down shack where she used to sleep beside her grandmother. When she returned to the apartment, she saw a test print of her photo laid out on a Voss & Co. brochure beneath the slogan, "From courage, a future blossoms." Leona picked it up and tore it in half. For the first time in her life, she felt used, like something shiny meant to be displayed, then discarded when no longer in style. Grandma Essie walked in, saw her granddaughter's face, and said softly, "I told you, child, old debts always come with new costs." And for the first time, Leona understood what her grandmother once meant. Not everyone who says thank you truly means it. She clenched her fists. She knew what she had to do. And by morning, she was gone. Leona left no note, just a blank sheet of paper that the wind caught, lifting it off the balcony, spinning it through the city skyline before it disappeared. Like the slender girl herself, once called a hero on the news, now just a silent name among polished, forgettable faces. She returned to the old slum at sunset. No one welcomed her. A few stray kids kept kicking a crushed beer can down the alley like always. The women selling food at the curb glanced at her. Part curiosity, part pity. She knocked on the door of the tiny house that used to be her whole world. It was locked, frozen. She ran door to door, asking everyone. After nearly 2 hours, she finally heard something that made her chest tighten. Essie had been taken to the emergency room the day before. Heart attack. No one could reach you. Mr. Voss's people handled everything. Word is, she's been moved to a private hospital. Leona bit her lip. Her chest felt like it was collapsing. Why hadn't anyone told her? Why had her grandmother been alone while she was busy playing her part in some glittering photo op, mouthing hollow speeches? Anger, sadness, and something that felt dangerously close to betrayal. The next day, when Harlan found Leona, sitting in the corner of the old park where she and her grandmother used to feed breadcrumbs to birds, he arrived in a crisp suit, but his eyes no longer held their usual chill. He sat beside her and said quietly, "I made sure your grandmother was cared for. Everything's been handled." Leona didn't look at him. "And yet I didn't know." Her voice was hoarse. "I'm not a tool to save your reputation." He said nothing. And in that moment, he wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a PR strategist. He was just an old man facing the one thing money couldn't fix, broken trust. He looked at her for a long time. "You're right," he said. "I used to think doing the right thing could erase the wrong. But maybe the best thing I can do now is step back and let someone else choose their own way to live." Leona didn't answer. She only lowered her head and wiped her tears with the back of her thin hand. A few hours later, she returned to the hospital. Essie was still asleep, the heart monitor ticking softly beside her. Leona sat down, took that wrinkled hand in hers, and whispered, "I'm sorry I wasn't there. But I'm back now, Grandma." And in the dim light, Leona held her hand tightly, as if holding on to all the things that mattered, slipping away in a world too shiny and far too cold. That night, Leona didn't leave Essie's hospital bedside. The steady beep of the heart monitor became a lullaby, lulling her into a restless sleep filled with flickering images. The burning car, Harlan Voss's face, and her grandmother's tired eyes looping again and again. The next morning, when Essie woke, she didn't ask where Leona had been. She didn't scold or reproach her. She just reached for her hand and said softly, "I dreamt of your mother last night. She was smiling, like when she was little." Leona stayed quiet. For years, her mother had never spoken a word about her father. Not a name, not a photo, not even a passing hint. It was as if he'd never existed. This time, Leona asked, "Grandma, who was my father?" Essie turned her face away. It was a long time before she finally sighed and said, "He was a gentler soul than this world ever made room for. A man your mother loved with all her heart, even knowing it would only end in sorrow." And then, the truth began to pour out, like a long-awaited rain after a brutal drought. She told her that years ago, while working as a maid for the Voss family, she'd witnessed a forbidden love between the master's only son, Elliot Voss, and a young black woman, Leona's mother. They loved each other in secret, Essie said, but deeper than anyone ever knew. He swore he'd fight to marry her. Leona held her breath. But then the accident happened. Elliot's car went off a cliff during a weekend trip, and only Harlan knew who he was planning to take with him that day. "It was your mother," Essie whispered. "After Elliot died, Harlan severed all ties. He moved your mother far away, paid for her to finish college, but on one condition: she could never speak the name Voss again." Leona sat in stunned silence. It had never crossed her mind that Harlan Voss could be her grandfather. "I believe he regrets it," Essie said, "but he didn't know how to make it right, so he let time erase it all, like it never happened." The room went quiet. Essie gently squeezed Leona's hand. "You saved him, Leona, but maybe you also pulled a buried secret back into the light. Be careful. Powerful men don't like their past catching up with them." Leona left the hospital with her thoughts in a storm. She looked toward the tall building where Harlan Voss lived, a single question rising louder and louder in her chest. Why did you keep me a secret all these years? And that night, as she stood before the cold apartment door, ready to knock 3 honest times, she understood. Sometimes, to truly forgive, you have to dig all the way down to the root of the pain. The door swung open after 3 firm knocks. Standing before Leona was Mr. Voss, Harlan, in a dark robe, his eyes unfocused, like he hadn't fully woken from a long dream. Leona looked up at him, no longer the timid girl from weeks ago. She met his gaze and asked, "Why did you never tell me the truth?" Harlan froze. For the first time in years, he was struck by a look that made him step back, not out of anger, but because of how piercingly clear the question was. "You know everything?" he whispered. Leona nodded. "About my mother. About my father, about Elliot." He turned away. His trembling hands gripped the arm of a nearby chair. There were no denials now, no room left for evasion. "Why did you make my mother live her whole life like a shadow?" Leona pressed on, her voice tight. "Why did you let her die while I grew up never knowing who my father was?" Harlan sat down as if his legs could no longer bear the weight of the guilt he had buried for so long. "Because I was afraid," he said softly. "Afraid that seeing you would be like seeing Elliot all over again." Silence fell. The warm light cast over his gray hair made his face seem to age a decade in a heartbeat. "You look too much like him. The voice, the eyes, even the way you ran into that burning car. No hesitation, no fear. Elliot was like that too. He believed love could conquer everything." Leona said nothing. His words echoed in her mind, sharp as needles. "Back then, I chose reputation over my son. Chose silence over standing for the truth," Harlan continued, his eyes fixed on his trembling hands. "I was afraid if you knew, you'd hate me, just like I've never been able to forgive myself." Leona turned away. Tears slid down her cheeks. He slowly reached out, not touching her, just letting his hand rest in the air between them. Waiting. And then he said once more, in the same voice he'd used the day she pulled him from the burning car, "You have every right not to forgive me. But please, don't carry the bitterness I've carried. It eats at you, the way it's eaten at me all my life." This time, Leona understood. That whisper wasn't an apology. It was a release. For him and for her. The next morning, it rained. Not heavily, just a gentle drizzle, like tears someone forgot to wipe away. Leona woke up early. Her heart was still heavy from the conversation with Harlan the night before. But in her mind, one question kept echoing. What if forgiveness isn't for him, but for me? She stepped quietly into Essie's room, where her grandmother was still under special care. Her silver hair lay soft against the pillow, her face paler than before, but still holding that familiar peace. In her hands was the old wooden box Leona had seen once before. This time, the lid wasn't locked. It was wide open, like a door to the past ready for Leona to step through. Inside were letters. Worn, some yellowed with age, each one marked with the same name in the corner, Elliot Voss. Leona gently picked them up, one by one. Each letter was a thread of time, from her mother's earliest notes to her father when they were secretly in love under Harlan's old roof, to the sharp, aching words she wrote after Elliot disappeared, forced by his family to leave the girl he loved. An unsent letter bore a scribbled line. If you knew the truth, would you still call him father? Leona clutched the paper. For a moment, she could see her mother, a young girl, writing those final words in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, her hand trembling, eyes swollen from crying. She left the hospital, went to Mr. Voss, not to confront him, but to place the letters Essie had kept right in front of him. I think you need to read these, she said softly. All of them, completely. Harlan looked at the stack, then at Leona. He didn't say a word. His hands, once shaky from age, now held the letters, like they were touching the deepest scar of his life. Leona turned to go, but he called out, Do you want to know why your mother never said anything to me? She stopped, because she loved your father, but she didn't want you to grow up in hate, so she chose silence to give me a chance to become someone better if I ever wanted to. In that moment, Leona understood, forgiveness isn't about erasing pain. It's about choosing not to pass it on. The rain continued into the next week, sometimes a drizzle, sometimes a downpour, as if the sky itself was learning how to let something go. Leona sat beside Mr. Voss's hospital bed. The room was quiet, filled only with the slow beeping of a heart monitor, like time itself was tiptoeing, careful not to disturb this final meeting between two souls, one young, one old, each broken by fate in their own way. He had read every letter. Some nights he cried when no one was watching. Only the elderly nurse told Leona, quietly, there are sobs people keep caged in their chest for a lifetime. When they finally escape, that's when real living begins. Essie was slowly recovering too. She didn't hate Mr. Voss, strangely enough. When Leona asked her why, she simply smiled and said, people are only frightening when they don't yet know they're wrong. That morning, Mr. Voss asked to see Leona alone. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were clearer than she'd ever seen, like he was no longer carrying the weight of reputation, but instead holding the final light of truth. I can't undo the past, he said, voice raspy. But there's one thing I'd like to do, if you'll allow it. Leona sat down, her hand gently closing over his. I've amended my will, he said. A portion of my estate, not much, will go toward a scholarship fund named after your mother and father, so that children like you can go further than their parents ever dreamed. Leona couldn't speak. Tears spilled, warm and steady, falling onto the back of the wrinkled hand holding hers. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. And you know, he whispered, his voice like a breeze. That day you knelt beside me in the middle of the smoke and fire. You asked, what should I do? Leona nodded. She'd been too shaken then to hear his reply. He closed his eyes and murmured, speaking to the past, to everything that had gone unsaid. I whispered, to live the life you deserve, not like me. Don't let silence slowly kill your heart. The last time Leona saw him, he was sleeping, peacefully, as if the heavy weight of his mistakes had finally been lifted. Beside his bed sat the silver watch, no longer a symbol of misunderstanding, but a piece of the past that had been acknowledged, forgiven, and left behind. Outside, the rain had stopped, and in Leona's heart, a new chapter had begun.